My dad told the waiter, "She's not part of our tab." I just said, "You're right." Then I paid for everyone else and left him with the $200 bill. The second decline chimed through the little card reader like a dropped fork, and my father's jaw went tight in a way I'd spent 31 years learning to read. The waiter, a kid with a name tag that read Dev, and the particular stillness of someone who'd done this exact walk of shame before, just never for a table this expensive, bent low and said something near my father's ear that made the color drop clean out of his face. My father reached for a second card without looking at anyone, handed it over like it hadn't just happened. Dev disappeared toward the register again, and the table sat there in the kind of silence that has a temperature to it. 12 people who'd been laughing an hour earlier now watching my father's hands. He had no idea I'd known for 3 days already. But to understand how we got here, you need to know what he didn't. 3 days earlier, standing in his home office with his own credit card statements spread across his desk, my hand actually shaking as I read them, while he was 2 rooms away asking my mother if she'd seen his good cufflinks. And before that, you need to know something older, a pattern I'd been quietly cataloging since I was 21 years old, long before I had any proof it would ever add up to anything. I'd been renting a studio 11 minutes from Marcello's for 2 years, working the closing shift at a garden center for $14.50 an hour while I sent out applications most nights after my feet stopped aching. And for most of that time, my father treated my apartment the way you'd treat a phase, something you didn't need to take seriously because it would eventually correct itself. My mother, Helen, kept a spare key to my place on her ring and never used it, the way you keep a spare key to a door you're afraid might already be locked for good. My brother Grant had followed the path my father actually respected. Business degree, junior partner track at the family's logistics consulting firm, married young to a woman named Monica who laughed at all of Dad's jokes on the first telling. I didn't resent Grant for that. I resented the math my father had built where love and money were the same currency, and I'd been running a deficit in his ledger since I was 22. He said it to me plainly, once, standing in this same kitchen where I'd later find the statements, "Respect is earned by what you can pay for." He wasn't being cruel when he said it, that was the terrifying part. He believed it the way other people believe in gravity. Cycle 1. The first time I understood the shape of it, I was 21, home from college for Grant's birthday. Dad handed him the keys to a used Accord in the driveway, cameras out, the whole family clapping, and told him it was an investment in a young man who was going somewhere. I told myself it wasn't personal. Grant was 2 years older, maybe it was just an age thing, maybe my turn was coming. Then my own 21st birthday came 4 months later, and instead of a gift, my father sat me down at that same kitchen table and gave me a 20-minute lecture about budgeting, ending with, "I'd rather teach you to fish than hand you one." I laughed along at the time, because that's what you do. My stomach didn't drop that day so much as it just quietly hollowed out. I asked my mother, months later, if Dad had given Grant a budgeting lecture too. She got very interested in the dish she was drying and said, "It's different with your brother." I brought it up to my father once, carefully, and he told me I was being sensitive, that comparison was a losing game, and that if I wanted a car, I should get a job that could pay for one. I dropped it. I always dropped it. Cycle 2. 2 years ago, I gave notice on a bad roommate situation and needed help covering a security deposit. $1,100, a number I still remember exactly because I asked for it so carefully in a private message, specifically so nobody else would have to know I'd asked. My father said no. Not unkindly exactly. He had a whole framework for it, something about how bailing me out now would only delay the lesson I needed to learn. I told myself that was fair, that maybe he was right, that struggling now might actually build something in me. Then, 3 weeks later, at Thanksgiving, in front of my aunt and uncle and Grant and Monica, he brought it up unprompted. She asked me for rent money like I'm a bank, and everyone laughed the practice laugh you laugh at a joke you've heard the shape of before. I sat there with a fork halfway to my mouth, my face burning, and said nothing, because saying something had never once changed the outcome, only extended the conversation. I moved into the studio on my own 3 months later, on a payment plan with the landlord that took me 8 months to pay off. I never told my father that part. Cycle 3. 3 weeks before the retirement dinner, I got the call I'd been chasing for 14 months, a data analyst position at Corville Freight, salary, benefits, a signing bonus that hit my account the next morning. I didn't tell anyone, not my mother, not Grant, and especially not my father, because some instinct built over a decade of cycles 1 and 2 told me that if I handed him this news too early, he'd find a way to make it small before I'd even had the chance to feel it be big. A comment about how it was about time, or a story about someone else's kid making twice as much, delivered with just enough warmth that I'd spend a week wondering if I'd imagined the sting. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then, at dinner the following Sunday, my father spent 40 minutes describing Gordon Aldrich's son's new promotion in granular, admiring detail, and never once asked what I'd been up to at work. I told myself it was nothing. It usually was, until it wasn't. Cycle 4. The credit card statements weren't something I went looking for. I'd gone to my parents' house that Tuesday for what was supposed to be an ordinary dinner, and I'd walked into my father's office to wash paint off my hands after helping my mother move a bookshelf, because the office had the only working sink on that side of the house. The statements were sitting in a fanned-out pile on his desk, the kind of mess a person makes when they've stopped hiding something from themselves, even if they're still hiding it from everyone else. I told myself it was nothing. Old bills. A renovation he hadn't mentioned. I almost walked back out without looking twice. Then I saw the balance on the top one, a number with too many digits before the decimal to be anything but bad, and beneath it, in smaller print, the words, "Past due, final notice." There were 4 cards in that pile. All 4 were maxed. One had a collections notice stapled behind it, dated 6 weeks earlier. My stomach dropped in that specific physical way, like a floor giving out from under a chair you thought was solid. I stood there with wet hands and read them twice, trying to make the number mean something else. It didn't. My father, who had spent my entire adult life narrating, loudly and often, the difference between people who who contributed and people who lived off others, who'd made me sit through a budgeting lecture on my 21st birthday and turned down $1,100 for a security deposit on principle, was 3 overdue notices deep into a financial collapse nobody in the family knew about. I almost asked my mother that night. I got as far as the kitchen doorway, watching her hum while she dried a mixing bowl, and I lost my nerve. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself I needed more information before I blew up whatever fragile arrangement was keeping this family upright. I put my coat on and drove home instead, and I didn't say a word to anyone for 3 days. Cycle 5. Those 3 days I tried to fix it the quiet way, the way I'd always tried to fix things in this family. Carefully, indirectly, without ever making him feel cornered. I called my new employer's HR office the morning after I found the statements. Not because I doubted my own job offer, but because I needed to hold something solid in my hands, while everything else in my family felt like it was dissolving. Renata Osei, Corvallis' HR director, 11 years in HR leadership, walked me through my offer letter again over the phone. Patient in the specific way people are patient with someone who clearly needs the reassurance more than the information. Salary, $68,000. Signing bonus, $4,000, already deposited. Start date, 3 weeks out. It was real. It had been real the whole time. I just never told anyone. I called my mother's sister, my Aunt Priya, the only person in the family my father had never managed to fully script, and asked her carefully whether she knew anything about money trouble on Dad's side. She went quiet for a long moment, and then told me Gordon Aldrich had mentioned, at a golf outing weeks earlier, that the firm's newest contract had fallen through, and that Dad had been handling it privately. Handling it privately, I now understood, meant 4 maxed cards and a collections notice sitting in a desk drawer while he planned a $60 an entree retirement dinner for 12 people. I even drafted a text to my father twice, asking if everything was okay, and deleted it both times, because I didn't yet know how to ask a man who'd spent 30 years performing Control whether he'd lost it. I hadn't planned to use any of it at the dinner. I'd planned, honestly, to just sit through the usual performance the way I'd sat through 100 smaller versions of it, drive home, and figure out what to do with what I knew on my own time. The retirement dinner was his idea from the start, and it had his fingerprints on every inch of it. Marcellos, white tablecloths, wine bottles lining the walls like a private cellar, entrees that started at $60 before you'd ordered a single appetizer, soft jazz threaded through hidden speakers just loud enough to make you lower your voice without noticing you'd done it. 12 people at a long table. My mother, Grant and Monica, my father's longtime business partner Gordon Aldrich and his wife, 2 of my father's siblings, and me, seated at the far end like an afterthought he'd remembered to invite but not to place. "Get whatever you want," he announced when the waiter came around, loud enough for the whole restaurant to register the gesture. "Tonight's on me." Glasses went up. Somebody at the other end of the table ordered a second bottle before the first had even breathed. Then Dev turned to me, and my father said it again. The same line he'd said once already under his breath while we were still finding our seats, except this time he wanted the table to hear it. "She's not part of our tab." The table went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when everyone's deciding whether to make it worse by reacting. My uncle blinked. My mother stared hard at her menu like it might rearrange itself into a different conversation. I felt my whole face go hot. "Dad," I started. "You heard me," he said, not even looking up from the wine list. "You can pay for yourself." Grant smirked into his water glass. Monica looked away. The same practiced not my business look she'd perfected over 6 years of marriage into this family. "Why?" I asked. Quiet. Because I already knew the shape of the answer, and I wanted to hear him say it anyway, out loud, in front of witnesses, for reasons I couldn't have explained to myself in that moment. "Because you don't contribute to this family," he said. "You live off other people. Time you learn to stand on your own." I nodded slowly. Set my menu down flat on the tablecloth. "You're right," I said. That surprised him. I watched it land, watched him brace for tears or an argument and get neither. I just smiled and told him I'd handle my own tab. He grinned, satisfied, the performance back on track, and turned to the table like a conductor resuming a symphony. "Now, where were we?" I ordered a Caesar salad and water. Dev's eyebrows went up a fraction of an inch before he caught himself. My father laughed loud enough for 3 tables over to hear it. "See? Can't even afford a real meal." My uncle chuckled along. Grant shook his head like I was an embarrassment he'd long since made peace with. I said nothing. Appetizers came and went. Entrees came and went. Lobster, steak, a rack of lamb Gordon Aldrich photographed for his own social media before he'd cut into it. My father kept the wine moving, kept the toasts coming, kept narrating his own generosity to a table that had mostly stopped listening and started just nodding along. I sat with my water glass, sweating a ring onto the tablecloth, and watched a man perform a version of himself he could no longer actually afford. 2 hours later, the check came. My father handed over his card with a grin that hadn't dimmed once through appetizers, entrees, or the 3rd bottle of wine somebody had insisted on. "Pleasure doing business with you all." Dev took the card and disappeared. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I watched my father check his watch twice, the first genuine flicker of unease I'd seen in him all night. When Dev came back, he bent low and said something I couldn't hear from my end of the table, but I didn't need to hear it. I'd already watched the color leave my father's face once tonight, over a much smaller steak, and this was the same expression turned up to full volume. He handed over a second card. Declined. A third. Declined. The laughter around the table died the way laughter dies when everyone realizes, at the same moment, that the story they're in has quietly become a different one. My mother's hand went to her purse. My uncle cleared his throat and reached for his own wallet, the way people do when they're trying to save someone from a fall they can already see coming. "Sir," Dev said. Polite, firm, clearly trained for exactly this moment, even if he'd never expected to use it on a table like ours. "The total is $1,147.83. My father looked looked around the table, and for the first time all night, he looked like a man asking a question instead of answering one. Maybe we can split. That's when I stood up. I've got it. Every head at the table turned. What? My father said. I said, I've got it. I walked toward Dev, past my father's chair, close enough to smell the wine on him. I'll cover everyone's meal. My mother reached for my sleeve, whispered that I didn't have to, and I told her gently that I knew. Except his, I said, nodding toward my father without looking directly at him. He's not part of my tab. Dev blinked once, professional to the last inch of him. Yes, ma'am. I handed him my card, the new one, the one that had come in the mail 4 days after the signing bonus cleared, and told him to add 25% gratuity. He practically ran to process it. My father stood, his voice doing something I'd never heard it do before, something close to shaking. You can't. This is my dinner. Was, I said quietly. It was your dinner until you decided I wasn't part of this family's tab. I didn't mean you did. Dev came back with the receipt. I signed it. $1,559 total, gratuity included, and turned to my father one last time. Your meal was $127 plus your drinks. Figure it out. I picked up my purse and looked around the table. My mother crying quietly into a cloth napkin. Grant frozen with his fork still in his hand. My uncle staring at his own untouched wine. Everyone waiting for my father to say something. He didn't. He also didn't have a choice 3 days later, when Gordon Aldrich sat him down at the firm's office and told him, in front of the firm's accountant, that word of the declined cards had already reached 2 of the firm's largest clients through Gordon's wife, who'd been at the table and hadn't been able to keep it to herself. Gordon put it plainly, according to what my mother told me later. A man whose personal cards had just failed in front of 12 witnesses was not a man his biggest clients wanted representing the firm's financial judgment at its own retirement gala the following month. The gala was quietly canceled within the week. Dana Whitfield, CPA, had done my father's books, personal and business both, for 18 years, long enough to know exactly how bad the picture actually was before anyone else in the family did. She was the one who finally sat my mother down, 2 weeks after the dinner, spreading 18 months of statements across the same kitchen table where I'd once been lectured about budgeting, and explained that my father had taken out a second mortgage on the house 14 months earlier without telling her, using the funds to cover a business shortfall he'd been certain would resolve itself before anyone noticed. It hadn't resolved itself. It had grown quietly, the way debt does when you keep servicing the appearance of solvency instead of the debt itself. One card to pay another card's minimum, a habit that works exactly until it doesn't. My mother found out through Inez Calloway, the branch manager at their joint bank, 22 years in retail banking, that a line of credit tied to both their names had been frozen 2 weeks before the retirement dinner, which meant my father had known, walking into Marcello's that night, that his own accounts were already failing, and had chosen white tablecloths and a $60 entree floor anyway, because the performance of providing had always mattered to him more than the provision itself. Inez told my mother gently that she'd tried to flag the account activity months earlier through a standard courtesy call, and that my father had told her everything was under control and asked her not to mention it to my mother. My mother sat with that fact for a long time before she said anything at all. I want to say I felt vindicated when all of it came out. Mostly I felt tired and something closer to grief than victory, watching a man who'd built his entire identity on being the one who paid Discover in public exactly what it felt like to be the one who couldn't. The exposure didn't end there, and I don't think it should have. A story like this doesn't get to end the moment the checks stop clearing. A month after the dinner, Perry Colson, a bankruptcy attorney with 11 years specializing in small business insolvency, sat my father down for an intake meeting my mother insisted on attending, and walked him through what a Chapter 7 filing would actually mean, which assets were protected, which weren't, what creditors could and couldn't touch, and how long the whole process would sit on record afterward. My father asked at one point whether any of it could be kept quiet from the extended family. Perry told him, not unkindly, that bankruptcy filings are a matter of public record, and that the version of privacy my father was asking for hadn't existed the moment his card declined in front of 12 witnesses at Marcello's. Gordon Aldrich quietly bought out my father's remaining stake in the firm, rather than let the whole partnership go down with him, which meant my father lost not just the money, but the title he'd worn like a second skin for 26 years. Grant, who'd spent 6 years on the junior partner track my father had built specifically for him, found himself reporting to Gordon directly for the first time, in a firm that no longer had a Ferris name attached to the door. I watched something shift in my brother over those weeks. Not sympathy for me exactly, but a kind of quiet recalculating, like he was running the same math I'd run years earlier, and getting a very different answer than the one he'd been raised to expect. And in the middle of untangling all of it, Dana Whitfield found something none of us had been looking for. A second line of credit, opened 8 months earlier, in my mother's name, that my mother had never signed for and never known existed. My father had forged her signature. He hadn't just been hiding his own collapse, he'd been quietly borrowing against hers to slow it down. My mother didn't scream when she found out. She went very still. The same stillness I recognized from myself 3 days before the dinner, the stillness of someone doing math they don't want to finish. She asked Dana, in a voice that had gone flat and careful, whether that counted as fraud even between spouses. Dana said gently that it was more complicated than that, but that it was absolutely something my mother could report if she chose to. My mother didn't report it. She moved into my aunt's guest room 2 weeks later instead. She's still there. I paid for a Caesar salad that night in the end, the only thing on my own tab, the only thing I'd actually ordered. My father never did figure out the $120 he owed me. He never sent it. I never asked for it. It stopped being about the money the moment I said the words back to him. He called me once, about 6 weeks after the dinner, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't known how to tell any of us how bad it had gotten, that admitting it out loud felt like admitting he'd stopped being the man he'd spent his whole life performing, the provider, the king, the one whose money made him matter. I told him I believed that. I also told him that not knowing how to say something out loud didn't give him the right to humiliate humiliate the one person in the family who'd actually learned, the hard way, how to stand on her own, which was, I reminded him, exactly what he'd told me to do, at a kitchen table on my 21st birthday, and again over a Thanksgiving turkey, and again in front of a waiter named Dev on the last night he could still afford to pretend otherwise. I did what you said, I told him, and I meant every word of it. I figured it out on my own. Turns out you're the one who never learned how. He didn't have an answer for that either. I still work at Corvale. I got a raise in March. I bought myself a real coat this winter, the first one I've owned that wasn't secondhand, and I paid for it with my own card, the way I've paid for everything since that night at Marcello's. Every bill, every dinner, every quiet, ordinary Tuesday that belongs entirely to me now, on nobody else's tab but my own.